Thanks for having me. Good to see you all again. So this is actually my 19th and final book-related talk. The book is called Analytic Activism. It came out December 1, 2016. And what I want to do today is spend about half the time talking to you about the book and the argument that I offer in it and what I think it means for us in this community, and spend the other half of the time discussing the 2017 and beyond element. December 1, 2016 is a very strange time to have your book that you spent 4 years writing about digital politics, mostly in America, come out in the United States. Because there's this thing that happened that we didn't expect was going to happen, and that kind of changes a lot of our perspectives. And I also think for us here in the e-government, e-democracy, open democracy research community, I think it's important for us to acknowledge and reflect that so far 2017 and much of 2016 has been a bad year for the topics that we study. Right? That one of the premises of e-government is a premise that democratic engagement is a good thing. Autocracy is bad for those premises. And autocracy is on the rise in a lot of countries. So I've been spending a lot of time in the course of these book talks over the past several months, both discussing the book and also reflecting on what does it mean for us going forward, and that's part of what I'm going to spend my time today talking with you about as well. So to begin with the book, Analytic Activism. This book began after I heard a conversation at a practitioner conference called Netroots Nation in the summer of 2012, so right around the time that the Move On Effect was coming out, actually. And I was about to go to lunch with a friend of mine who's the head of an advocacy nonprofit in the United States. And as we were getting ready to go to lunch, she got into a conversation with another executive director who she was working on a coalition campaign with. And they got into the conversation about a tactic. They were about to put ads up in the air in the state of Wisconsin on a recall campaign against the Governor Scott Walker. And she had one vision of the ad, he had another vision of the ad. And they got into what I like to think is the tactical conversation. Any of you who have experience in government or in advocacy have probably seen this conversation. It is an argument by attrition, where the one person presents their vision, then the other person presents their separate vision, and then they keep on talking back and forth until one of them gets too exhausted and gives up. Or they agree to table the conversation for next time, or the person with some type of structural power, usually in advocacy the white male in the room, weighs in and makes the decision for them. So I was watching that happen, and what I was thinking to myself actually was, oh God, it's lunchtime, this is going to take forever. How do I politely get out of here? And instead, after she presented her vision, he presented his vision, she said, well, let's test it. And he said, yeah, let's test it. And that struck me as new and different and important and completely ignored within the research space. And so the good news was that I got to go to lunch, and the bad news is I had this dawning realization that I was going to have to write another book. 2 laughs. That's my best laugh line in this entire talk. Come on, come on. So broadly what I'm arguing in this book is that I think within the research community we have mostly been looking at new forms of digital speech. This is particularly true for those of us who study online advocacy and online activism. So the clicktivism or slacktivism debate is largely a debate about whether or not new types of online speech, petition signing, liking, sharing things on Facebook, retweeting things, whether those acts of digital speech are meaningful, whether they're good enough, whether they're as good as offline forms of participation. We as a research community figured out we need both online and offline, and they interact back and forth, and yet we all still stay mired in this slacktivism conversation. I would love it if we could move on. But we've been focusing on those digital acts of speech. And what I think has been missing from the conversation is also a focus on how those acts of speech leave digital traces that can be gathered together to form new types of listening. So this is analytics-based listening and learning that allows organizations to adapt new strategies and tactics and governance styles that can help them succeed in the digital era. And the book is about these new forms of listening and how we can use them. I also find Nick Denton's quote here very useful. Nick Denton was the founder of Gawker.com, which was a major online news site, a set of online news sites that particularly specialized in gossip. Gawker.com is now gone because of a lawsuit that we can talk about in Q&A if you haven't heard about it. It's a pretty big deal for US media, but doesn't really translate to much abroad. But what Nick Denton said in an interview at one point was that probably the biggest change in internet media isn't the immediacy of it or the low costs, but the measurability. And this image behind me, that's of a couple of people looking at the big board at Gawker.com. The big board, which though Gawker is gone, I have seen at the Washington Post, and we have at most other news organizations now, is an analytics dashboard that all the journalists get to stare at all day. That tells them which stories are the most shared, which are the most retweeted, which are the most commented upon. It is their new way of keeping score in journalism. Now, I mentioned this briefly in our panel yesterday, but I'm pretty well convinced that one of the reasons why Donald Trump became the Republican nominee is because of the influence of the big board and analytics in newsrooms. In the older newsrooms, journalists would not have had that daily indicator of how much more popular their Donald Trump stories are than their Marco Rubio stories. And that would have led to some normal news routines that we're used to, which they cover the one Republican candidate and then they switch to the next one. But with that new feedback loop, we had newsrooms saying, wow, you know what people really want? From their revealed preferences, their clicks, clearly they just want Donald Trump all the time. So the newsrooms gave it to them. The head of CBS News, Les Moonves, was quoted as saying he wasn't sure if Donald Trump was good for America, but he sure was good for CBS. The remarkable thing to me about that quote is that in 2016, they had a way of knowing how good Donald Trump is for CBS. In 1996 or 2006, they wouldn't have had that same indicator. So analytics, that feedback loop, that listening form, leads journalism to operate in different ways. And the argument in the book is that we're seeing similar developments amongst netroots organizations in advocacy and activism. One other quote that I think sums this up well, this is from a senior analytics staffer at a US nonprofit. If you're not looking at your data, then you're not listening to your members, and that probably makes you kind of an asshole. Again, one laugh. This is my best material. I think it's important though because that is a very different view of analytics and listening than I think we're used to, particularly in the academic conversation. Right? Listening digital listening carries two connotations. One is your concerns are being heard. It's the connotation Karen was just discussing with us. The other, coming from someone like Edward Snowden, when he talks about digital listening, what he's saying is they can hear you even though you don't know you're being recorded. I talk in the book, in chapter 2 of the book, about sort of how we should calibrate our concerns in this area. Because there are some spaces, for instance, when government is spying on people, I think we should be deeply concerned. When our data is being aggregated and sold to banks and other corporations, I think we should be quite worried and we should regulate. When advocacy nonprofits are running A/B tests to figure out which type of appeal is more likely to get you to click and sign, I think we can be less concerned. And I offer a framework in the book, which I won't talk about today unless you want to hear about in Q&A. But that type of listening, it means something different for a nonprofit where they have data on what their members want and they can use it or they could not use it, than a government saying, okay, let's use this to find out who our supporters are and who our opponents are, and then act accordingly. Now, there's one other big theoretical construct that I want to lay down for you. This is in chapter 1 of the book. It's what I call a media theory of movement power. It's the reason why all this stuff matters. Within the space of advocacy and activism, the big puzzle that we never know how to solve is what impact does anything have? What impact do we have for any of our actions? So for instance, in the digital petitions conversation, I always get reporter calls saying, hey, are digital petitions effective? And they expect me to say, no, no, they're not, or yes, yes, they always are. And the answer, like any good academic answer, is, well, it depends. Right? Well, what does it depend on? It depends not just on how many people have signed it or how good of a petition it is, but also who it's targeted at and how that petition is used in a broader campaign. Now, in the book, I discuss this media theory of movement power with a reference to the civil rights movement in the United States from 50 years ago. Civil rights movement activists were brilliantly strategic, not just at thinking about their own activist resources. So there was the famous march to Selma, Alabama, or at least famous in the United States. I don't know if this audience knows it. But these activists marched into Selma, Alabama to demand their voting rights. And they did this knowing that the sheriff of Selma, Alabama was going to overreact violently and turn the dogs and the hoses on them. So they knew that they had their resources, their ability and their courage to march. They also were well aware of their target, that their opponent, this sheriff, would overreact. The sheriff does not overreact, and at the end of the day, they have tired legs and no social change. So they had a clear sense of who is our opponent and what will they do. But along with that, they also had a clear sense of the affordances of the media environment. The 1960s were the height of the industrial broadcast era in the United States. There were 3 television stations, and if their cameras were there and they all caught it, then the entire nation would have a choice of either watching what was on TV or talking to their families. 4 laughs at that. Okay, we're doing better. So the reason why that worked, again, if they had marched and the sheriff had attacked them and no cameras were there, that would be yet another act of violence against black Americans, which we have a long multi-century history of in the United States. It still continues today, by the way. So what they realized in that tactic was we have our resources, we know how our opponent will react, and we understand that this will be captured by the broadcast media system and capture the attention of the nation. That's how they formulated that strategy, and that's what made that tactic so powerful. It wasn't just the marching or the number of marchers. It was how the marching would be responded to by their opponents, received by their targets, and refracted and reflected by the media environment. This is critical for us today when we think about advocacy and activism, because while we still have many of the same resources, we can still march, we can still write letters, make phone calls. Now we have more resources. Now we can also send emails and retweet things. We have different targets. Donald Trump is a very different target as a president than George W. Bush or Barack Obama were. And so activists need to change their tactics to adapt to those targets. And we also have a very different media system than we had 50 years ago. In fact, we have a different media system than we had 5 years ago. Again, because of this analytics-based listening. We are still developing this digital hybrid media environment and learning what the weaknesses and affordances of that system are. So the argument in the book is that in this landscape, where the effectiveness of activism is going to come down to these 3 factors, an effective strategy is going to require us to both be creative about our resources, creative about understanding our opponents and our targets, and creative about understanding the media system, which is still changing. What organizations need to do is develop practices of listening and testing so that they can try things out, make mistakes, and improve. And that's analytic activism. So a couple examples of this. This is from a slide share from Upworthy.com. Chapter 4 in the book is about Upworthy. Upworthy.com back in 2013 kind of dominated the internet. They kind of, actually, a year later, apologized for breaking the internet. So there was a good year and a half where all of Facebook, at least in the United States, was dominated by these very clicky headlines with things like, somebody did something, you'll never guess what, you won't believe what happened next. And Upworthy was leading the way with those headlines and using them to get millions of people to click on stories and videos about things like police violence in New York City or teens that died from rare cancers. Boring, sad stuff. But stuff that actually was heart-rending if you took the time to watch the videos. And Upworthy, in explaining their philosophy, said what they were trying to do with their model of virality was find high-quality content that hadn't reached its audience, because it wasn't framed right. So they were looking for videos that, if they had been seen, would be shared at a high rate on Facebook and on Twitter. And then they would just do basic A/B testing to figure out what types of headlines will get people to click on this. Because if they click on it, they will share it. That makes it different than the standard clickbait, which people will click and then they say, oh God, I can't believe I fell for this slideshow. I hate that site. We still have plenty of clickbait on the web. What they had figured out was the notion of sharebait. That once we find something that people will share, once they've viewed it, we can use basic A/B testing to figure out what's the language that will get them to click on it to begin with. And that unleashed some massive potential for people viewing online videos about high-quality content. That's something other than just basic cat videos and entertainment. Now, there's a story in the book as well about Upworthy's eventual, they're still here, but they declined from their peak. Because it turns out that if your business model is focused on Facebook, Facebook will eventually come around and say, that's a great business model, it would be terrible if something happened to it. We would like those views now, please. So Facebook essentially cut into their business model and said, we're just going to do that through Facebook video, and that hurt their model. So that story is in there, but I'm going to set that aside because I want to talk about some broader things today. A second example, and this is from the digital petition space, which is what Chapter 3 is about. This is a petition from change.org, which I think is a classic example of how digital petitioning operates at its most effective within the media theory of movement power. So this is a bunch of high school students at Trumbull High School in Connecticut. The high school drama club had decided in the spring to put together a show called Rent. Show of hands who's heard of Rent? A few of you. It is a very, very popular musical from the 1990s about New York City and AIDS in the 1990s. It was tremendously cutting edge for the mid-1990s. This story happens in 2013, 2014. So the students had decided they wanted to do the student version of Rent in the spring. Over the summer, the public high school got a new principal. The principal came in and said, "You cannot do that play, it's too risque for my tastes." Students were outraged, they started a petition. Pretty much the entire high school signed a petition. What do you think the principal of the high school, I think this translates internationally, what do you think the principal of the high school says when he gets a petition from all the high school students asking him to change his mind? Any guesses?
Do it.
Don't do it.
Trolls.
No, he doesn't say trolls, he says, that's very cute, no. High school principals are very adept at saying no to high school students when they ask them to do something they didn't want to do. That's part of the job description, is don't bend when the students ask you for something. But since this was a digital petition at change.org, what happened next will kind of amaze you. Which is that a change.org staffer put the ArtSpeak columnist at the New York Times in touch with this petition. The ArtSpeak columnist at the New York Times thought this was a fun David and Goliath story, wrote a little blog post about it. It got covered in several other online publications as well, local newspapers, Playbill magazine. Suddenly, the high school principal has gone from being in conflict with his own students to being the laughingstock of the New York Times. How many minutes do you think it takes him to fold on that issue? Like under an hour. Right, so what we're seeing there is that these digital tactics, when they are used as media objects, can gain great power as indirect political tools. It's not the direct petitioning that does it. It's the way that that digital petition can be an object that signals to the media there's a story here. If Change.org just called up the ArtSpeak columnist and said, "You'll never believe this, a principal at a high school you've never heard of just said no to a play with students you haven't heard of," that doesn't go so well. But there's a big petition online and it's being ignored by this mean principal, yeah, that's worth a few paragraphs. So that's part of what we're seeing here, is if we want to understand the efficacy of digital tactics, we need to understand their power within this hybrid media system, which requires a lot of testing and a lot of trying things out. So broadly, what I'm arguing here is that analytic activism, which is not all online activism, is a particular style of online activism which relies on analytics and digital listening, and promotes a culture of testing through the construction of new strategic objects. Now this is my favorite example of a strategic object. This is the testing whiteboard at 38 Degrees. 38 Degrees is the UK's sister organization to MoveOn.org in the States. When I visited them it was the summer of 2013, they had on this whiteboard one question: how do we increase active membership by 30%? So I asked them, hey, tell me the story of this whiteboard. And what they told me was that every week they have a team in their office that brainstorms a question that is worth testing out. That was the question that particular week. They come up with a question, some hypotheses, some thoughts on how to measure it, and then they spend a week trying things out. And at the end of the week, they discuss what they learned and report that back in the following week's staff meeting. So this is a learning cycle that they're installing. Again, this is that premise question of, well, let's go test it. Now, if we have an experimentalist in the room, these are not experiments that would pass peer review. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that they've created a learning pathway, a strategic object, a thing that they all try out and then report up the hierarchy. This is important, particularly for eGov folks. What we largely see today in advocacy organizations and in digital government is organizations that have heard that they need to adopt some analytics. So they hire like a junior staffer or an intern and say, you're in charge of the analytics, make them all go up. That's not analytic activism. That's not analytic governance. That's not analytic anything. And the difference there is that if that staffer is not empowered to lead the organization in a different direction, if that information isn't flowing into the strategic meetings, the board meeting, or at least the staff meeting, then it's not making a difference in their work. It's not a way for them to learn new things and try out new tactics and strategies. But if it is incorporated into their work, then it is an imperfect but still valuable learning tool and listening tool that can lead them to new tactics and strategies. Now there are two big limitations that I spell out in the book for this new type of learning process. The first, I'm going to run through these quickly because again I want to talk a bit more about post-Trump. But the first is what I call the analytics floor. This is the theoretical threshold below which you are too small to engage in this listening and learning. My favorite example of this, when I was giving pre-book talks, someone would always raise their hand and sort of jokingly say, oh, so are you going to A/B test the title of your book? And I would say, no, I can't do that. It wouldn't work because of the analytics floor. Right? In order to do an effective A/B test, you want hundreds, if not thousands at least, to see version A and version B, so that you can measure from the clicks a statistically significant answer for which of these is more popular. Academic books like mine simply do not get enough traffic to be A/B tested. Your book, we could have A/B tested the title. 50,000 copies? I will not sell 50,000 copies if I write 20 books in my lifetime. That's awesome. But for an academic book, yeah, we can't do that because it's too small. This has some really fascinating applications cross-nationally, by the way. My third book, which will come out in like 5 years or so I'll work on it. But my third book is going to be on the internationalization of the Netroots move-on style model. And in smaller countries, countries like Sweden and New Zealand, they have move-on style organizations that can't do the daily testing that a MoveOn.org or a GetUp in Australia or a 38 Degrees does, because their national populations are so small that their equivalent membership of 1 or 2% of the national population is in the tens or hundreds of thousands. That's too small for them to do the type of testing that we see in the larger, amongst these organizations and organizations. And for organizations in small issue areas or governments of small towns, they can mimic the analytic activism done at the larger scale, but they can't gain the statistical power that you can at the larger scale. So analytic activism provides increasing returns to scale. I think it's important for us to keep. The second then is what I call the analytics frontier. This is the negative corollary to Dan Ariely's saying that you are what you measure. You probably aren't what you have trouble measuring. Now, this is particularly important in activism because the big influence in activism has been coming from electoral campaigns, because that's where the money is, right? That's where the market is, that's where the money is. And electoral campaigns are actually very simple. We have a set end date and a set victory condition. We know on November 9th who won the US presidency, and I can slowly get over my hangover as a result. If you are working on climate change, if you are working on gun reform, if you are working on refugee policy, there is no clear end date and there is no clear victory condition. Which means that that question of what should we be measuring and how do we know if it's working becomes a challenging, open, strategic question when it has a pretty simple answer for electoral campaigns. And most of these testing tools are developed in elections and then exported to advocacy and activism. So that creates some biases towards the most easily measured things in the electoral world. So I talk in chapter 5 of the book about the efforts that have been going on amongst advocacy and activist organizations to expand the analytics frontier and make sure that they're measuring for the right things. To make sure that the tools that they use in their analytics reflect their values and reflect their priorities. I won't go into the examples now. If you want to hear more, I can tell you about it in Q&A. But there is this inertial bias in favor of the metrics that are easiest to track. And this also creates a challenge for organizations and a potential bias. Because if we focus on the things that are easiest to track, then analytics can be used either to help us make better decisions, or it can be used to avoid making decisions altogether. One of the worst phrases that I have heard from practitioners when I've given these talks is, well, we're just going to let the data decide for us. No. Letting the data decide means not investigating the biases in that data, not investigating what it can't tell you, and not thinking hard enough about what is our actual mission and vision, and how can we track that program. All of this stuff is messy. It doesn't provide perfect answers. But if organizations engage earnestly with that question of what's our strategic vision and how could we measure it, then they can use this to develop better learning pathways. Now, let me move to the post-book writing stuff. The argument of the book is about analytics as new learning routines. Since Donald Trump's election, I've seen this troubling trend resurface, which is, I think, a different vision of data. I think broadly there's two stories that we tell about big data and society. And one of them is false, but really attractive, and the other is true, but very complicated. So the first vision is of Neo and the Matrix, old dated reference, or data wizardry. And the other is about build, measure, learn cycles, agile development cycles, 18F, which we're very famous. I saw this in particular in the conversation that's been going on for months about this company called Cambridge Analytica. Show of hands, who's heard of Cambridge Analytica? Okay, many of you. That's true. So Cambridge Analytica had a tiny role in Brexit that's been often overstated. It had a tiny role in the Trump campaign that has often been overstated. They have a tremendous marketing team and a CEO who is great at making big pitches. This is the CEO, Alexander Nix, giving basically a TED-style talk about the power of big data and psychographics. The story that he sold was that through Facebook quizzes, his company, Cambridge Analytica, has developed a psychographic or psychological profile with the big 5 attributes of every citizen in the United States and Great Britain, and has attached that to the voter file so that rather than micro-targeting messages based on your likelihood of turnout or whether you're a Democrat or Republican, they can micro-target messages based on whether or not you're extroverted, whether or not you're particularly fearful. And they can use that to really very powerfully convince you to propagandize you, to get you to do what they want you to do. To get you to turn out to vote for Donald Trump or not turn out at all. It is a compelling story that taps into our fears of big data wizards transforming society. It's utter bullshit. We have found out, there's now been reporting through the New York Times, that they did not use psychographics in the US election. They just promised psychographics and then didn't provide them. That's not surprising because not only are psychographics not tested, but for you to do them, not only would you need to have a testing pool, you would need to attach it to the voter file, which is technically very difficult, and you would need an army of copywriters actually writing the different messages for the different psychological profiles. And we know for a fact that the Donald Trump campaign didn't have an army of copywriters. So it is demonstrably the case that they did not do any of these grand things. And yet, for months now, 4 or 5 months we're getting into, I continuously have been asked to respond to these questions about Cambridge Analytica, and didn't they sabotage the whole election? Aren't they the big data wizards behind it all that gave us this surprising result of Donald Trump? And I think the problem is the story that I'm telling in analytic activism, and the story which is found in 18F, which we were hearing about yesterday, in the US Digital Service, and the story which is broadly true, is a story in which strategy and listening with big data is still a giant moat. It is still an act of learning a little bit more, but along the way still having to figure out, do we have the right data? What can we learn from this data? What are the biases in this data? How did the world just change? How is it more complicated? And this is an ugly story to tell. Whereas the story that we see in Silicon Valley pitch decks, the story that we see from journalists in Wired magazine, the story that we see presented in movies like The Circle that just came out, which was David Eggers called first, is a story in which these data scientists have cracked the code to human behavior, and they understand everything while all the rest of us are still stuck knowing nothing. Now the troubling thing to me, the point I want to end on as a provocation, is that I think this connects to a broader conflict that we're seeing working out in society right now, which is the siren song of the populist demagogue that we now see installed in the United States and have been winning or gaining ground in a lot of other countries' elections. And the story that the populist demagogue tells us is that governance, public affairs, and social problems are in fact quite simple. And the reason why your lives or our country is not the way you wanted it to be is because it's being run by crooks and liars or idiots. right? So Donald Trump's promise that we're just going to throw the government out, he'll make great deals, and then everything will be fine. That is a populist demagogue's argument, and it's one that we've heard echo through history. But that is a story in which, in fact, governance is quite simple, politics is quite simple. You just got to throw out all the liars, all the crooks, and install all real pros, and then everything will be fine. Again, the right experts here, there is room for non-idiots, which is the Silicon Valley expert, or some other great scientist or great wizardly mind who makes perfect deals. And if we just have that right person, then we'll be winners against all of those losers. That's a story which sounds exactly like Donald Trump, but also sounds like the strongmen that are leading too many countries around the world and gaining ground throughout the world right now. Against that, we have the insights of the original brand of progressives. Progressivism, at least in the United States, started up in around the 1890s or so, and from the 1890s to the 1920s, progressivism fundamentally was an argument that said government and governance is hard, it requires scientific management and learning and practice, and therefore we should hire experts who can work hard at this. Bureaucracy is fundamentally, if it's good bureaucracy, that's fundamentally a progressive value. This stuff is hard, so let's try to do it well and muddle through along the way. What we're seeing right now is this fundamental conflict between progressivism and populism. And on the populist side, I think we have this data wizardry story. I think when we, either in Silicon Valley or all of us academics, when we're selling our story to a journalist or writing that grant application, when we tell a story about how computational social science is going to unlock the secrets of humanity, we know we're lying. Our reviewers know we're lying. At least I hope we know we're lying. But we are telling that story because it is an easy story to tell. Because it is a populist story that says there are experts and I'm one of them. And we all know in our hearts that it's much messier than that, but we don't tell that story. Instead, we tell a story about the populists and their wizards. That is an easy story that pulls great. And that it tells us that if things are wrong, it's just because we have this wrong experts running things. The other side here is the progressives and their scientists, which is a tough story but has the benefit of being true. And it is a story in which data still plays an important role, but rather than the data wizards who know all, instead what we have is build, measure, learn cycles, agile development cycles, in which our products are still going to come in 6 months late, over budget, and full of bugs. But over time, they actually become better. Society today has a lot of stuff that we couldn't imagine 10 years ago. That's because of build, measure, learn cycles, not because of any data wizards. So I think that it is incumbent upon all of us, given that 2017 so far has been a bad year for what we study. I've been reflecting since the book came out on my fundamental commitment to progressivism in its oldest sense. I would argue to you, and this is my last slide closing up, that the fields of e-government and open democracy are built upon progressive assumptions. The reason why we think about open democracy and e-government, things like service delivery from government agencies, that's based on an assumption that government agencies with better data and better practices will do better work. That is 19-teens progressivism, scientific management. We believe, the reason why we study what we do, is that we believe that government and governance are hard and complicated, and through research and study we can help it work a bit better. That at least is my commitment to this research, and I think it's most of our commitment. I don't think we have a lot of populists, like populist demagogues in the research community. Because if you thought everything was really simple, why would you devote yourself to getting a PhD, really? So I think it's important for us to expand our field of vision as a research community now that these assumptions have been challenged. It is no longer a certainty that the governments in our countries, our stable democracies even, are going to treat progressive governance as a given. The Donald Trump administration is shutting down open government because open government allows it to be critiqued, and they've realized that that is bad for their business. 4 years ago, if I had stood up here and told you that progressive governance and the notion of transparency and open democracy are under threat, are in doubt, are not valued by government, you would have said, who is this raving lunatic? Come on. Now it is the only voice of sanity we can have if we're taking what this administration does seriously. and what other administrations around the world are doing, seriously. So if that fundamental value that underlies our research community is under threat, then I think we need to take it seriously in our research. And that means expanding our field of vision to incorporate the advocacy efforts that are aimed at defending this progressive, open, and democratic governance. Tying it back to the book, I think that means studying both all of these acts of digital speech, what people say online and what it means, and also the listening and learning processes that help advocates to be more effective in defending these values. Thank you. So I was aiming to be provocative. I hope now to find out that I've provoked.
Thank you, Dave, very much for your keynote.